Good afternoon, good evening. Waiting for everybody to join in. It's another shamanic coffee hour. One of the things I noticed by looking at I can see sort of like what time people are joining and that sort of thing is that the peak of when people join in is about 7 minutes in for some reason. So it's a good thing I talk for a while, I guess. Good morning. Welcome again. Welcome back. Nice to see familiar people joining back in. I think it does take a little while for the I'm using the streaming software so that I can talk over multiple channels at the same time. So this is on my Facebook page, it's on YouTube, it's on Twitter, Instagram, and I think Twitch. I think I can go to 5 channels at one time. So anyway, welcome to another shamanic coffee hour. Today, I'm going to talk about the divine masculine and the divine feminine. I'm going to talk about what they are. I'm talking about why it's important, why we might want to know what they are along our spiritual journey, and deal with a few misconceptions, maybe that may be common. I don't know. It seems to be, from my perspective. From my perspective, I see a lot of teaching about divine masculine, divine feminine that is, uh, a kind of a misunderstanding, I guess, and a little bit of a an unbalanced way of presenting these things. And I understand why that is the case, and I'll talk about that as well. So, um, and I should say, if you're on YouTube or Facebook at least, I can see your comments and questions. So if you have anything that you're wondering about, or a question about something I've said, or you need clarification because I haven't explained something well enough, feel free to drop a comment and I will read it. So let's get into divine masculine, divine feminine, the archetypal principles of divinity. Hey, good morning. um, Archetypal principles of gender. Uh, I almost hesitate. You heard me hesitate a little bit to say the word gender. And the reason for that is that the concept of gender carries with it a lot of baggage. As you can see, just look around in the world. Um, we have the idea of biological sex, right? Your most people are born either one sex or the other. There are people who are born biologically intersex. Um, that happens. And then there is gender, which is socialized identity. And um, if you don't think that's true, I mean, there are a fair number of people in the world saying, you're born with your gender. You just have to look at historically how gender expression has changed significantly. A couple hundred years ago, men wore makeup and powdered wigs, right? If you did that today, you would have a very different, and there are men who do, but there you would have a very different perception of that person's gender identity. Gender roles, the ideas about what's appropriate for different genders. We put boys in blue and girls in pink when they're born. That has flipped around. There's no set in stone about gender expression. So gender identity, gender expression are individualistic, they're cultural. There are cultures, existing cultures that recognize more than two genders. That's the other thing. There are indigenous cultures where there are five genders. There are uh, indigenous American tribes that I know about that have what they call two spirits, people who have both gendered spirits in them. We would I don't know what we would call them, non-binary, I guess, as a more modern term, but they're called two spirits, and they're considered to be very special and very holy people. And in a lot of uh, there, so gender roles, gender, very cultural, change over time, all of that stuff. Very, very, very little to do with the concepts of divine masculine and divine feminine. Biology, very, very little to do with the concepts of divine masculine and the divine feminine. These are divine archetypal energies and or impulses, and I almost wish they had chosen different names for them, but historically, these are the terms. And in the book The Kybalion, which is a hermetic text written in the early, I think the early 20th century, by a group of sort of mystical students, um, who to this day are sort of anonymous, although they think they know who wrote this. The Kybalion talks about these different principles, and one of the principles is the principle of gender. And it says that everything has its masculine and feminine aspect. It doesn't say that everything is either masculine or feminine. It says everything is or has both a masculine and feminine impulses, or aspects, or however you want to put it. So there's very little to do with biological sex, very little to do with gender as a socialized cultural structure or gender identity or anything along those lines. Um, and so, historically, in very recent history, so we're talking about like, stuff that's gone on in the past couple thousand years. Um, we have most of us in living in Western cultures have lived in a and many Eastern cultures have lived in very patriarchal society. You hear people talk about the patriarchy as a political structure, but it's more than that. It's um, you know, the patriarchy, when you think about patriarchal system, it's a little bit like a pyramid scheme. You have very important person on top, and then a layer of somewhat less important and somewhat less important and somewhat less important. And then in the very bottom, you have us folks. And so patriarchal systems are like a lot of modern governments. You have a president or prime minister who's at the top. Below that, you have, you know, another layer of people who are sort of, in charge. Below them, you have another layer. And at the very, very bottom, so this giant pyramid. And it's the same way with spiritual systems as well. A lot of spiritual systems where you have a pope or a Dalai Lama or a grand whatever. Yeah, gender expression is fluidic and on a spectrum for sure. Yes, be yourself. Absolutely. Free of labels. Yeah, I mean, I'm an older guy. I guess middle age and hopefully middle age. Um, and so a lot of these terms, a lot of very modern terms for gender expression and sexuality and stuff, I do sometimes get confused by them. And I apologize if I do. I want people to be who they are. I want people to you know, do their thing. And I fully support that 100%. Um, but I get somebody's like, "Oh, is that person pansexual or bisexual?" And I was like, I don't know. Like, do we need to put a label on it necessarily? And what does that even mean? And what's the difference?" And you ask different people, they'll have different ideas. So, I don't, I won't get into the label thing too much. Just to say that has very, very little to do with these sort of divine, what we're calling the divine aspects, divine masculine, divine feminine. So anyway, go back to the patriarchy. We live in this patriarchy. It's a very pyramidal system. This doesn't mean because it's patriarchy, meaning, fatherly. Um, Pater is actually Proto-Indo-European for father, and one of the first gods they were able to cobble together the name of in Proto-Indo-European is Deus Pater, and that means basically sky daddy. Clearly, a god of the sky was important to those people, but it's where we get the word deity. It's where we get the word Zeus and Jupiter, and all kinds of words come down from that Deus Pater. Um, Anyway, complete tangent. So we have these patriarchal systems. That doesn't mean that women can't be on top of a patriarchal system. They can, and it absolutely happens. Not as much, obviously, in culture that I live in. Still, the vast majority of people on top are men. It's shifting, but regardless, it is, it's a system that's self-supporting, self-replicating. And so as a reaction, so the patriarchy, when it came through, one of the ways it came through into culture is at the lead of the Roman army, right? So the Romans sent their armies full of men through and took over all of a good portion of Europe and a good portion of Asia and all of this stuff, and the Middle East and down into Africa. And then at some point, they flipped the script. They were a pagan culture, still very patriarchal, but they were pagan culture. So they had gods and goddesses, and there were temples to Isis everywhere. And then Constantine, the Roman emperor, decided everybody's going to be Christian from here on out, and they tore down the temples and they got rid of all the priests and persecuted the people who didn't convert, and that that's history. So they put this, they're like, oh, we're gonna have this one, or the Holy Roman Emperor who's gonna be in charge of all this stuff. And you know that is sort of one of the ways the patriarchy came in. And so they got rid of gods and goddesses, so there was less balance. And I'm not, don't think I'm bashing Christianity. This is just the history of exactly what happened. So Christianity was forced on people across the world at that point, where the Roman army was. And at the time there were a lot of competing religions going on. So the cult of Mithras, for example, was really popular. We don't have a lot of writings about it because it was an initiatory cult, very popular apparently with Roman soldiers, because they found Mithraims, which are these underground temples where they would hold feasts and things, um, at Roman outposts everywhere. So there's a bunch of them in the UK. There's tons in all over Europe. Wherever the Roman army was, they found these temples to Mithras. But it was initiatory, and they didn't write things down. So what we know about them comes from people outside writing, but also just archaeological findings. So there are statues and wall art and stuff, but nothing written down really well. So, um, so we took, so as a reaction to this patriarchy, um, there has been, in very recent history, there has been a resurgence of, you know, more feminine aspects of spirituality. We have things like paganism, neo-paganism. We have Wicca coming up as a uh, religion that balances. They have a god and a goddess, and they sort of try to balance those energies out. Um, and so that is those systems try to sort of reconcile. But I think what kind of happens a little bit is we replace one page. So instead of worshiping a single god who's seen as male by most of his worshipers, uh, shift over to placing a lot of emphasis on the female side as a pendulum swing from one side to the other. Um, but I would actually argue that there there needs to be a balance. So out of balance in either direction is not the thing. Is not really the thing. And not to say that you know uh, going out of balance into the feminine is as necessarily destructive or whatever as the patriarchy, but I'll talk about that. I'll talk about what happens when those impulses get out of balance in either direction. So the divine feminine, if you were to go to Amazon right now and you were to do a search on divine feminine, you would find probably hundreds, thousand, maybe 1,000 books referencing the divine feminine. If you were to search on the divine masculine, you might find one or two, maybe three, if you're lucky, books about the divine masculine. Nobody is approaching the divine masculine. And the problem is that frequently people I've spoken to who I consider very learned spiritual teachers will go, "Oh, the divine masculine, that's the patriarchy or whatever." It isn't. That is not the patriarchy is not the divine aspect of the masculine. It is an out of balance, immature aspect of the masculine. This impulse to have control over people is not the divine impulse. And that's what the patriarchy is. It's having control over other people who are below you on the rung. And it is an out of balance. So bring you don't bring us into balance culturally, spiritually by not doing work to repair and realign with the divine masculine while addressing and lifting up and promoting the divine feminine. It's both that bring us into balance. We're out of balance in both directions. We have too much in patriarchal culture. We have too much emphasis on what we think is masculine but isn't, is very immature masculine at its best, and very shadowy masculine at its worst. This is where things like religious violence and racism and things like that come in. That is not divine. That is an out of balance masculine, very immature masculine. It's what we call boy psychology. Um, so the flip side is that the people who think they're aligning with the divine feminine sometimes are expressing very the sometimes expressing a masculine, even an immature masculine impulse, but putting a putting a female gender on it, right? And so again, that's not really the balance that we're looking for. So let me talk a little bit about what divine masculine, divine feminine is, so we can look for it. Because they're archetypal, they can be a little bit challenging to kind of see. Um, but I'll explain them in a few different ways that hopefully make things a little bit clearer. So I like if you've ever read any of Ken Wilber, he has a million books out. I don't know exactly how to describe him other than he is a philosopher amongst many things, and has written a ton of books on all kinds of things, including spirituality. Um, and he has created this sort of system he calls integral. It's very nerdy, and I don't use that to put him down or whatever. I'm very nerdy. It's very systematic and how to look at, it's like this grid at how to look at anything. And you have different lines and different levels and different depths, and it's this multi-dimensional grid of how to sort of examine anything. You can get really lost in that stuff, and so it may not be for everyone, but I think it's useful and good, and it's a nice model for looking at all kinds of things. So, um, Ken Wilber discusses the divine masculine and the divine feminine impulses, and he talks about them. He uses a couple of terms, Greek terms for love, because there's only one in English, um, to describe these impulses. So the masculine impulse he describes as he uses the term eros, right? So eros is where we get the word erotic from, which is, this idea of physical romantic love and, whatever. And then for the divine feminine, he uses the term agape, and agape is this sort of familial love, love of mankind, love of your family, this nurturing kind of love. And you can start to see the just in the use of those terms, which I think was pretty smart on his part, you can start to see some of the differences between these impulses. So it's important. He describes this by using the term holon. A holon is a unit of anything, right? Is anything that can be seen as a distinct unit, right? So a person is a holon, right? I'm a spirit, I have a body, I have thoughts, I have a name, I have all that, but all that stuff fits into, conceptually, I can fit into one package, a holon. But also, as you go down, you can chunk down into different levels. Like I have organs in my body, and each organ is a whole on it. It is complete thing that it works with other things. But yeah, it's part of a system. A system is a whole on. The organ is a whole on. Then you can go down into individual cells. Those are holons, right? Then you can go into atoms, and each atom is a holon. So we have this it's just conceptual. You have these holons, you have these individual things. So we'll look at people because we are, most of us, I'm assuming, are people on here. Maybe some robots on here. I don't know. Or ghosts. If you're a ghost, welcome. And welcome all spirits. So we'll look at people. So a person as a holon, we have um psilocybin connection discusses holons quite a bit. Oh, excellent. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Yeah, I forget who came up with the term holon, but somebody came up with that term as a way of, oh yeah, let's look at an individual system. So you can think of a person as a system of systems, as interlocking, interweaving, interpenetrating systems, right? Or series of bodies. They have a physical body, a mental body, an energy body, a soul body, all of these things. But we can put that all together and say this person, this being. Um, and so the divine masculine impulse is the impulse for that holon to evolve. Could be physically, could be spiritually, could be mentally, right? So I have this impulse to learn as much as I can. I have this impulse to evolve, to reach to the next level, however you're conceiving of that, right? That's a divine masculine impulse, is to raise myself up as a holon. Um, so you can see very clearly that it doesn't matter what your sex or gender identity is, we all have that impulse in some way, right? I look at my girlfriend, for example, and we paint together. We've been painting together recently, and I'm very much like I'm gonna slap paint on there, very impressionistic, whatever. And she's like, I've got to get this blending perfect. And this doesn't look, exactly the way I want. And she just wants to get better and better and better and better. That's a very divine masculine impulse. She's trying to evolve. And I am too, not to the same extent. I don't feel for whatever reason the same pressure to um and I will say she's a much better artist than I am. She's a very gifted painter. And I'm, I I guess I don't take things as seriously. But that is a divine masculine impulse, right? This individual to evolve in some direction to get better and better. None of that has to do with being better than anybody else. None of that has to do with competition. None of that has to do with gaining power over anybody. Okay. So the divine masculine says, I am going to raise myself up so I show up in a better way in the world. The immature masculine, as opposed, or the shadow masculine says, I am going to raise myself up so I am better than those people. So I have power over those people. So I have, so I can control those people. Right. That is a very lonely place to be at the top. At the top. Um, you could not pay me enough money or give me enough things or promise me anything to be the president or a king or whatever. You know, it- you see how, people love you, people hate you. It ages you. It's just this, this power positions. I'm also not anybody's guru. I have students, but they're students. They don't bow down to me. They don't take my word over their own reasoning, anything. I'm not trying to set up a new patriarchal system with a group of students. So that's the divine masculine. It's this impulse to improve as a whole. On this is the way Ken Wilber describes it. The divine feminine, on the other end, is about gathering up the other holons and creating something. This is where the word synergy comes in, creating something that's greater than the parts of the individual parts when put together are greater than they would have been. So this is about gathering and nurturing and combining and making connections. That's the divine feminine impulse. And so we can see that when we look at this person. So I have cells in my body, but if they were just individual cells that weren't working together, weren't forming organs or bones or, eyes, um, I'm not starting a cult today. Yeah, maybe tomorrow. I don't know. We'll see. No, I was like, man, I thought at one point, I'm like, wow, having a cult must be exhausting. I have no I have no, absolutely no time for that, no energy for that. I don't have the energy to run anybody else's life, or the desire. It's funny to me how, that does it for some people, but again, I think those are aspects of the masculine that are out of balance, way out of balance. And you see tons of abuses. You see abuse of power all over the place, right? So, what happens when these things are out of balance, when the masculine and the feminine are out of balance? Well, you have the masculine out of balance, not the divine masculine can't really be something that's divine can't really be out of balance. Um, but when you have too much emphasis on the masculine, what is seen as the masculine, on this impulse to improve, you have this very individualistic thinking, which is not absolutely wrong. It's not to say that being individualistic, it's not to say that wanting to evolve as a person, but wanting to do so at the expense of others or wanting to do so because you want to have power over others, that is out of balance. And way out of balance on the shadow aspect of the masculine, you have things like racial and religious violence. I have to be better so much. I have to, I cannot tolerate people who are different than me. I have to repress them or kill them or, destroy them because I might be wrong about how good I am. I might be wrong about how good my group of people is or my belief system or whatever. So that's way out of balance, okay? And there's a lot of movement there. The masculine is very active. On the other side, we have stagnation. We have no movement when the feminine gets out of balance. We don't have individuals stepping up, making decisions for things. So when I was one of my I spent a lot of time in grad school, and one of my stints in grad school, I was studying mediation actually, and uh, the our teacher, the professor, had brought this guy in who was a union mediator or ombudsman or something like that for the university. It's a big state university system, and he had this thing that happened that he described as he thought was, he thought was wonderful. He thought this was wonderful that all this was going on. So this individual in the university was promoted, and not an instructor, but some other, facilities or something like that, was promoted to a management position. And the way that it worked is once you were a manager, you were out of the union basically, and this particular union, and people were resentful, so they were acting up, they were not doing their job, they were sabotaging stuff, whatever. Um, they were resentful of this person getting promoted over them or whatever. And I don't know, I have no dog in that fight. So I don't know who was right or wrong or what they were doing or what he was doing or whatever. So anyway, so this came up to the ombudsman, and they started this series of talks and meetings, and um he was describing it. Okay, it started out with the people that worked in that department, and then they got the union involved, then they got the ombudsman, and then they got this person, they got this person, and it was this conflict amongst, three or four people that expanded across, that all of a sudden expanded across the entire university, and had been going on for um a couple of years or something, like an egregious period of time, in which nothing had been resolved other than they kept adding more people into the conversation. So that to me was an out of balance phenomenon because nothing was happening. They were stifling any sort of solution or evolution or whatever. It's not the divine feminine. The divine feminine absolutely would have gathered everybody around, nurtured them, made sure they had what they need. Okay. But at the end of the day, everybody's got a job to do. And so I was like, it was like very proud of all of this gathering that they had done. And I was like, I came from the private sector. I worked for, um, I worked in financial services back then, and a mazillion years ago. And, I was like, if I'm at my job and somebody's promoted above me, and then I decide I don't like them being promoted, I'm not gonna do my job anymore. Like, I don't have a job. Like, sometimes I have to put up with a manager I don't exactly like, or, whatever, for the good of my job, but also for the good of the organization. So again, the divine feminine is looking out for the group of the organization, knowing that the organization, should work together harmoniously to have the best efficiency and the maximum impact. And so it really is about raising up, a rising tide lifts all ships, right? It's about lifting everybody up. It's not about the divine feminine is not about keeping everybody at the same level. It's about lifting everybody up. So if you have the divine masculine, which is about the individual lifting themselves up, evolving, balance with the divine feminine saying, "Hey, I'm going to get better so I can help everybody get better." You have you can have a really wonderful situation. I've seen very few situations in which those things are imbalanced, but it's something we can shoot for. So that is one way of looking at the divine masculine, divine feminine. And by the way, if you're wondering, I am drinking Pete's coffee today. I don't know which blend. It's one of their medium blends. Might be Big Bang, which is one of their medium blends. Absolutely delicious. Pete's one of my favorite brands of coffee. Maybe they'll sponsor me one day. I don't know. um, so that's one way of looking, this way that Ken Wilber looks at the divine masculine, divine feminine. These are archetypal impulses. They exist in everyone and everything. Like I said, the Kybalion says the principle of gender is in everything on all planes. Everything has its masculine and feminine aspects or expressions. Everything. Not everything has one or the other. Everything has both expressions. You know, um, one of my soul purposes, for lack of a better term, soul contracts, soul missions here. And this has been, I've had numerous people, shamans and, other other spiritual workers tell me, this is your mission. I'm like, yeah, I get it. Is to bring balance in whatever way that I can to things. And so, um, part of me talking about this today is an effort to sort of bring balance. And it's really interesting that when I go to shamanic gatherings, at least around here, most of the time I'm the only male in the room. Maybe the it would be rare if there were 20 people in the room and two or three of us were men. Um, and or and I don't just mean biologically. I mean how people are presenting themselves. Um, and so I get that comment a lot, like, "Oh, you're here to bring some balance." And I'm like, "Well, that's placing a little bit of weight on me considering I'm outnumbered, but I'll do what I can." Um, so another way of looking at these aspects, most people are familiar. Uh, I would say almost everybody's familiar with the Chinese symbol of yin and yang, right? The white swoosh and the black swoosh. And there's a black dot in the white swoosh, and there's a white dot in the black swoosh. That circle with the yin yang. I should have had the graphic that I could have popped up, but people know what I'm talking about. And if you don't, you can Google it very easily. Yin and yang, or in Japanese, in and yo. So yang is considered the masculine side of that diagram. And that is the white swoosh with the black dot in it, which represents the feminine in the masculine. And on the other side, the black or dark side with the white dot in it, that is yin, or the feminine side. And this diagram is important because it shows both aspects in balance, but it's a dynamic balance, right? It shows almost movement when you look into that. So there's this dynamic balance that happens, like if you're riding a bike, and you know, very hard to balance a bike that, I know people can do it, but very hard to balance a bike that's not moving. Um, and then you have in the black swoosh, in the yin, you have a dot of the yang, and in the yang, you have a dot of the yin. This shows the masculine in the feminine in the masculine. You cannot pull one out and have it. Like, it's not a hold-on at that point. The hold-on is both in balance. And this comes out of Taoism, and Taoism is always trying to balance, bring yin and yang into balance. Um, why? Because for one, they're looking at the health of the body, and they look at different aspects of the body, like hot and cold and dry and moist and the five elements and all of these things that they have. I'm not an expert in Chinese medicine, but they look at all of these things and they know that the healthiest bodies, and these Taoist monks who live up in the mountains that do all this work, they live a really long time, very frequently into their hundreds. So they know that bringing balance to these things is important. So in their, you know, the way that they divide everything up, we could say that the masculine is the initiator, it's the active side, it's the, the projecting, and the yin side is the receptive, the receiving, the um I almost don't want to say passive, um because it's passive strength. It's you think of a womb as a space that is absolutely necessary for some, a being to be born, right? It's a space, it's a field that allows things to happen. You have to have both. And this is true in creation, manifestation, all of these aspects. In Not to go too far down this path, but in the Bible, when it says, in the beginning, God makes heaven and earth, right? In Genesis. The word that's used there, in Hebrew, is Elohim. And Elohim is translated into English very frequently as Lord or God or Father or whatever. Um, but there's a question about that because it is a feminine word, El. El means God or goddess. And the ending, Ohim, is like plural and masculine. So some people translate that as in the beginning, the gods and the goddesses. Um, and there are other translators and people now who are talking about, well, the Elohim was at one point like a race of beings. That's what they were, considered in really, really ancient times, these Elohim. But when things got translated, they're like, oh, well, there is only one God, masculine, so we're going to translate that as Lord or Father or God, or they're the words that we translate into words for God in the Bible in English. But if you look at Kabbalah, right, which is Jewish mysticism, but actually may not originate in Judaism, but certainly the way that it came down to us, uh, very much Jewish mysticism. It uses the Hebrew alphabet. It uses all of these mystical things tied together. So if you look at the Kabbalistic tree of life, at the very top of the tree of life, you have the crown, Kether, but outside of that, you have the Ein Sof which is just endless light. So no boundary, no beginning, no end, just infinity, infinite light. And then for creation to happen, and the Kabbalistic tree of life is a map of creation. You have at the very top, you have just limitless light, and then that branches down. It branches down into a feminine side and a masculine side. The first thing it does is it has to split apart. Kabbalah is extremely fascinating, yeah. Um, but it splits down into masculine and feminine aspects, and then it descends down through this tree, and there's a lot there. You can spend many lifetimes studying Kabbalah and never learn all of it, until it comes down to the very bottom of the tree, which is Malkuth, which means kingdom. Malkuth is the physical world, the physical universe. But there are 9 steps above the physical universe, but it is this map of creation. And there are, in Kabbalistic systems, there are angels and archangels and orders and things and all kinds of stuff associated with each of these, what they're called emanations, these levels, these sephiroth, they're emanations. I believe a single is a sephirah and plural is sephiroth. So you have all these, there are 10 of them, and the very bottom is physical manifestation. and the Kabbalah presents a map of creation down from the divine, but also if you follow the map in the other direction, so the map from the divine to creation is the lightning path because it looks like zigzagging lightning. And then winding back up the tree of life is the serpent path. Um, a spiritual belief without resulting psychic ability is just delusion, often associated with the drug that you use. Um, sure. I'm not sure how that comes into it, but talking about not exactly what I'm talking about this morning, but so anyway, in the Kabbalah system, there is the path that goes up from the physical world back to divinity, and the idea is that the individual who studies the Kabbalist works their way back up to oneness with divinity, complete non-dual experience. And non-dual experience is common in all mystical traditions that I'm aware of. Mystic Christianity, we have something called gnosis, where we get the word Gnostic from, Gnosis, um, which is it means knowing, but it that's a very loose translation that doesn't really capture what they're talking about. Gnosis is really about oneness with the divine state. Um, so you have that in Kabbalah, you have that in Sufism. I remember watching an interview with a Sufi dancer. If you've ever watched Sufi dance, it's really beautiful. But they spin, right? This is where they got the term whirling dervishes from. Um, and not all Sufi sects do the dancing, but this story that I've heard from somebody who lived in a Sufi community was that Rumi, the famous Sufi poet, was actually a dancer, and he would dance himself into an ecstatic state. Ecstatic comes from the Greek word ekstasis, meaning to stand outside of oneself, right? And so he would dance and then actually recite his poetry, and then other people would write it down. I don't know if that's true, but somebody who knows more about Sufism than I do um, told me that. Somebody who lived in a Sufi community for a period of time told me that story. So I'm apt to believe it as somebody who knows more than myself about that. So all mystical traditions have this concept of unity. That's what makes mysticism, right? Um, I don't know anything about palmistry anyway. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know anything about palmistry, and I only have in this hand, so I don't know if the lines in my palm are make any sense whatsoever. But so regardless, uh, back to the divine masculine, divine feminine aspects. So I was talking about yin and yang, and so there again, we're talking about these impulses. We're talking about the active impulse and the receptive impulse that are necessary for creation. So in the Kabbalistic model, again, we have the divine, which is pure unity, and that if you look at the yin yang symbol, the circle, the outer circle represents that unity. But then it splits into masculine and feminine aspects, and the path goes back and forth between these aspects of masculine and feminine until it comes down into um down into creation, into physical creation, and then going back up, you go back and forth into finer and finer um states of mind, states of awareness, spiritual states, all of these things. So we've got yin and yang, we've got Kabbalah, we've got, um, in some Gnostic, you can't really say Gnostics believed X because Gnosticism describes a great number of different religions, actually, all ostensibly Christian, but, and all all completely wiped out during the First Crusade. The Albigensian Crusade was actually not about the Middle East or taking Jerusalem or whatever. It was about wiping out competing sects of Christianity. So the Gnostics. So during that crusade, something like a third of the population of southern France was killed, completely wiped off the map. And so we've lost a lot of the teachings. There are texts. We have things like the Nag Hammadi library and things like that. But most Gnostic sects, and you could argue whether they were Christian or not, but they considered themselves Christian, and Christ was a figurehead amongst these sects. Um, Most of them had a feminine aspect, a goddess. Yeah, there was a god and a goddess. In fact, the creator of the physical world was sort of the almost the antichrist in some of these sects, and that physical matter was seen as a mistake that kept man from achieving his spiritual goals. Like, we're so attached to the physical that we don't do our spiritual work. We don't spiritually evolve, or um you know that sort of thing. So um so in Greek, that goddess sometimes is called Sophia, which happens to be the name of one of my daughters. um uh yeah, I know religions primarily are divided by, well, they're primarily divided by doctrine and dogma. And yeah, what part of that is what happens when the body dies. um but yeah, I would say that, um and I don't want to talk too much about religion, because the concepts of other than how the concepts of divine masculine and divine feminine are expressed through different spiritual systems, often polluted with lots of other stuff, like filtered through the patriarchy or whatever. But you see aspects of this. So in traditional Christianity, of course, there's great reverence for Mother Mary as a holy figure, the Holy Family. Although we have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which are all, I don't know if the Holy Spirit is considered feminine or whatever, but there is great reverence for female saints, particularly the particular Mary, Mother Mary. There were sects that at one point that revered the Magdalene, Mary Magdalene. The idea that she was a prostitute is not scripturally sound. It was sort of propaganda that happened when these competing sects of Christianity were repressed, and there were some that believed that Christ and Magdalene were husband and wife, and you can read about the whole Bajan and Lee, um, all that stuff, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, that led to the Dan Brown books of the Da Vinci Code and all that stuff. A lot of that is fiction, and a lot of that is based upon a very elaborate hoax um, that happened in France some time ago. Um, I think in the 40s and 50s, where this person tried to establish himself as a direct descendant of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and invented some documentation and inserted them into a library, some official library or something. So there was this big hoax, and unfortunately, a lot of stuff got tied into all of that. So, um, listen, um, thank you for coming on, and thank you for your comments. But I really, really don't want people coming in here and bashing other religions or other, you know, whatever your thoughts are. If they are, I'm not putting down other religions. I would ask you to not do the same in the comments here. Um, not particularly appreciated, and not what I'm about. This channel is about. I'm not bashing Jesus either. I am talking about what some sects of Christianity believed. am speaking about what these Gnostic sects believed. And so if you think I'm bashing Jesus, I'm sorry, you're absolutely wrong about that, 100%. So thank you. Thanks for joining. I will be deleting your comments afterwards. So unfortunately, they will come up. Um, well, now they won't come up anymore. I'm sorry. I'm not going to be able to see anybody else's comments at this point because I don't want to have I don't want to have hateful comments on this channel. I'm not about that ever. And I apologize if anybody thinks I'm bashing any particular religious system. I'm not. I'm, to my knowledge, factually describing what some people believed. And I'm talking about a hoax that's well documented that happened, and I said nothing negative about Jesus as far as I'm concerned. I don't hold a negative opinion about Christianity or Jesus or any of those things. And not what I'm talking about today anyway. Anyway, don't mean to get too far off track. I'm almost done here talking about um the divine masculine, divine feminine, which was the original topic before we went off on this whatever is going on here. Um So back to it. Um, when you put yourself out in public as one does, you get all kinds of feedback, not all of it positive or demonstrating an understanding of what I'm trying to talk about or do. So but absolutely I won't have hateful comments on here, and I'm not making hateful comments about anybody. I don't believe. And if I did, or if it was interpreted as such, I apologize, but not my intention. So these divine masculine, divine feminine aspects show up as sort of echoes, as cultural artifacts in many different systems, many different religions. Some of them are quite obvious. So in Hinduism, we have, you have gods and goddesses. You always have sort of balancing gods and goddesses, right? You have Shiva and Kali, and all of the different aspects of that. And not to talk about Hinduism with too broad a brush, because I realize that it represents, thousands of kinds of worship and thousands of kinds of gods and goddesses, and lots of different, very interesting traditions. I was reading about the Agora, who are these ascetics who do things like eat rotting meat and live in charnel grounds and do all this stuff. And I didn't realize that there are female Agora as well. Um, you know, uh, but very interesting and very far outside of my experience with anything. Um, so uh, anyway, you'll see echoes of that in many spiritual systems. Um, and that is, that's very typical in the echoes and sort of artifacts. And so back to it is that, you know, evolution as a culture, evolution, and this is, I'm not prescribing any particular spiritual system for anybody. Whatever you do is totally great. Um, but evolution as a culture means balancing these masculine feminine. You need the impulse of the masculine to initiate things, to initiate change, to initiate action, and you need the impulse of the feminine to gather these things into synergistic wholes, into holons. But also you need that to be the ground of creation, the womb of creation, that sort of thing. So it really is about bringing things more into balance. And with that, I'm coming to the end of my hour. Thank you for joining me. I would just remind people that I'm not, if you're going to come on here and comment, let's keep it pleasant. I'm trying to do that. If you don't like something I've said, That's fine. You don't have to hate on other people. You can hate on me, but you don't have to hate on other people or their belief system or anything along those lines. Um, let's keep it evolved. Okay. And the impulse to bash other people's spiritual systems is not has nothing to do with the divine. It has absolutely nothing to do with the divine. It's a very insecure form of masculinity. Anyway, with that, I will leave you for the day and enjoy your day. I love you all, and we'll talk soon.